Good afternoon and welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Emily Galvin-Almanza. So last week, Washington Governor Jay Inslee extended a statewide eviction moratorium through the end of June. That gives tenants in Washington a few more months of protection before they face the very real possibility of being kicked out of their homes. The move was undoubtedly welcome to those people who are falling behind on rent due to the economic impact of COVID-19. But the extension doesn't actually protect people from the inevitable. And that inevitable is the so-called evictions cliff. It delays the date on which thousands of Washingtonians will fall victim to an eviction machine that many landlords have been eagerly waiting to put into use. But today we're going to be talking about one important thing that can be done to give tenants in Washington a fighting chance against this eviction process that has been incredibly stacked against them. So under an ordinance introduced in the state legislature, anyone facing eviction would be guaranteed a right to legal counsel during these proceedings, regardless of their ability to pay. Now, put simply, going through any court proceeding without an attorney is really hard and terrifying, but going through eviction court without a lawyer by your side, by the numbers, is a losing proposition. Tenants without counsel are far more likely to lose their homes, which is the obvious bad outcome, have an eviction carried out by local sheriff's deputies. But there's other bad outcomes too. So people who don't have a lawyer in eviction court are more likely to be able to negotiate a move-out date or keep an eviction off their record so that they can find another apartment in the future. That makes them more unlikely to find rental or relocation assistance or to even be able to apply for public housing. All of these different layers of damage to people's ability to find housing in the future. And when I say people, let's keep in mind, I'm talking about parents, I'm talking about families, I'm talking about us. So while guaranteeing tenants in Washington a right to counsel may still not prevent evictions entirely, it would at least provide tenants with some level of protection whenever the moratorium expires. Protection from that wave of eviction proceedings that will begin at that expiration point. Here with us now to discuss the importance of a right to counsel legislation and the status of their bill in Washington are State Representative Nicole Macri and State Senator Patty Kuderer. Thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
So Representative, I'd love to start with you. Can you start by filling us in on the scope of the problem in Washington? What does eviction look like in the state? What's the landscape? And how do you expect things to change when that moratorium expires?
Yeah, so I'll say, Emily, this is an issue we've been working on for a while. And even long before the pandemic, we knew that tenants were vulnerable to eviction in Washington state. And we had been looking at, in particular, the disparities in who is most likely to be evicted and when evicted, who's most likely to become homeless. And we know that women of color, Black women in particular, in the county that I represent, are 6 to 7 times more likely to be evicted than white people. But what we found with the pandemic is that it threw hundreds of thousands of renters' lives into chaos. And currently in Washington state, we have nearly 500,000 people who are struggling to keep their homes. The latest data from the Census Bureau is that over 200,000 Washingtonians who are renters are behind on rent. And we know that more than 300,000 are paying their rent with credit cards or calling on friends and family to borrow money to pay rent. So exactly what, as you said, when the governor's eviction moratorium, which has been literally a lifesaver for hundreds of thousands of people in our state, when that expires in a couple of months, many people will be facing the prospect of eviction. So we have been working, we are currently in legislative session, and we have been working to put in place a number of policies and budget strategies to head off disastrous results for hundreds of thousands of people in our state.
Senator, I want to talk to you about why this is a top priority, because obviously in a pandemic landscape, housing is a top priority, but medical care and food benefits and childcare, like schools, like getting people, there's so many competing emergencies right now. And I'm interested to hear your perspective on why this right to counsel issue is such a top priority.
Thanks, Emily. I think you hit the nail on the head when you talked earlier about how people go into court and they are typically unrepresented in eviction proceedings. And the consequence is they lose their home. And the home is the foundation, I think, for your life, quite frankly. And I'm a lawyer. I know the benefits of having good counsel. And I also know that this legal proceeding that tenants go into, that a lot of times they don't even show up because they don't understand the process. So if we are able to have excellent, highly skilled attorneys who can help them navigate the process, we are more likely to save the tenancy, which is what we want to do, and help people climb out of this hole that they're in, not due to anything they did, but due to the pandemic. So I think it's money well spent looking at, no state has done this yet, made it a law. My bill, of course, would establish the right to counsel, but the cities that have done this, New York and San Francisco come to mind. The percentage of tenancies that are saved, I mean, the statistics are compelling, that this is really a good investment. It's good bang for the buck, because the costs of someone who ends up without a roof over their head, I mean, the cost to that individual and that family is incalculable to them, and obviously, but also there is a cost to society writ large. And that cost is far outweighed than the cost just simply to make sure that they have a lawyer at the eviction proceeding.
Yeah, indeed. I know that academic studies of right to counsel programs have shown that they pay for themselves, and that cities actually spend less on paying for lawyers for people than they do for all those costs that you're talking about. Do you think that will bear out here? I mean, is this being factored in as like a budget smart bill? Are you expecting an ROI that will be good for the state in terms of revenue?
Yes, I do, because if we are able to maintain the tenancies with the percentages that we've seen even out of these cities, these are people who will be able to keep their jobs, right? And if you're keeping your job, then you are paying taxes and you're buying things and you're investing in your community, and that keeps the economy going. So I do think we're going to see an ROI on this investment. And it's one of the pieces of this very large bill that we've put together over the last year. As Representative Macri pointed out, we've been in discussions on this since last session, quite frankly, before it even was over. And the point is to slow the process down so that the courts don't see a deluge all at once of eviction filings. And so we've also built in a piece in the bill that requires the parties to go to dispute resolution centers first. And that's where they'll engage in conciliation at the request of the tenant, or mediation at the request of both parties. And the hope is that we can solve these issues, because it's really a lack of resources issue, right? And we're hoping that we can solve the problem there before an eviction is even filed. The other thing that we did that I think is really crucial for this program to work is we have modified the notice that the landlord has to serve, or when they serve it. It includes information to the tenant that they may be qualified for legal representation. And there will be a number on there for them to call. And the goal is to give them this information with the intent that they will pick up the phone, call the Northwest Justice Project or the King County Housing Justice Project lawyers and start getting advice right away, including at the conciliation mediation step process. Because I think that that's also a place where we'd like to have representation. We're not mandating it there, but I think it would be great to have it there as well.
I'm gonna go full geek, and I'm gonna ask a question for either of you to answer. But I guess my question is this: obviously, when one is trying to intervene in an eviction or in a person's circumstances who are at risk of eviction, the earlier the better, right? If one can get there before an eviction is actually filed, before a notice is received, so much the better. Are those agencies that you just mentioned going to be set up and supported for walk-ins, for people who say, hey, I'm now 6 months behind on the rent and I haven't gotten a notice yet, but I think I'm going to, can you help me?
Yeah, well, I'll say that is the system we're trying to build, right? So thankfully, civil legal aid has been a bipartisan issue in Washington State. I think we see that nationally. I would say we have a long ways to go to fully fund and support our civil legal aid system in Washington State. But that bipartisan support has served us well in the considerations this session. So we are trying to put those pieces together. As you say, I have gone to eviction court several times to observe proceedings over the years in service to the tenant protection work that I've been legislating on over the past several years. And what we know is that typically tenants will show up at eviction court because they get a notice, and it will be the first time that they engage with an attorney if one is available at the courthouse. And in many courthouses, they are not available. As Senator Kuderer said, what we are looking to do is to inform tenants from the moment they receive a notice that not only might they be able to get assistance from an attorney, but if they are low income and facing eviction, they could have a right to receive representation in helping them navigate through court. And we believe that this will change the tenor of the proceedings and how landlords and tenants engage. We know that from what we've heard from other cities that have already enacted right to counsel is that the power dynamic shifts and there becomes more fairness in the process. Right now in Washington State, we continue to have a pretty high rate of default, meaning tenants don't even bother to show up for court because they know they are likely to be evicted anyway. And we believe that this is just really going to be a total game changer. And we've been glad that in working with landlords, in working on these bills with both tenant advocates and landlord advocates, that there is support for representation. And we expect through our budgeting process as well to see strong support for providing the resources so the courts can make this available to tenants.
So, Representative, I want to talk about, you mentioned landlords groups and tenants groups, and I think it was the senator who mentioned sort of the feeling of being a lawyer in that courtroom, right? You've got judges who right now are faced with unrepresented people who are really freaked out because they might lose their housing, which creates chaos in the courtroom. You've got tenants who obviously would be much better served if they were able to have expert help in the room. But you mentioned you're also working with landlords groups. So I'm very interested to hear, who supports this bill and who opposes it and why?
Yeah, well, I'll say the bill right now is in the House. So it is Senator Kuderer's bill, and it passed out of the Senate and over to the House. And actually today it is being moved out of committee, which is an exciting milestone for the bill. And there are, as Senator Kuderer described, there are many elements to the bill, including setting up parameters for repayment plans, because as I said, we know that hundreds of thousands of people are behind on rent right now. This is an unprecedented situation happening in many states across the country. Setting up a pathway to essentially divert people from court and have the dispute resolution centers help to resolve conflicts and help people engage with rental assistance programs, and ensuring when people do go to court before they get there that they are connected with attorneys. And as the bill has moved through the process, we've seen support grow. Unfortunately, it remains a relatively partisan issue, but we have seen landlord groups move to support the bill as we've continued to negotiate and refine the specific elements of it. So that's been heartening.
So speaking of partisanship, so last month, Data for Progress and the Lab, which is a project of the appeal, conducted a poll, and that poll found that 68% of voters, including 75% of Democrats, 71% of independents, and almost 60% of Republicans, support a right to counsel in eviction proceedings. So, Senator, as you crafted this bill, do you think the voters are ahead of their legislators on this? Do you think that anyone who's still dragging their feet on your bill is not aware that this is popular with voters? Do they not care? What's going on there?
Well, I think for some it's a money issue, but I am happy to report that the Senate released its budget today, and there's $44 million included in there for right to counsel. So we are funding it for the first biennium. And I'm excited about that. I think that this is really critical. Like I said, you can set up a program like this. If you don't put money behind it, it's not going to go anywhere. So in terms of why, yes, I do think that some of my colleagues are behind the voters on this. I think that, the voters completely understand the value of having someone with them, guide them through a process like this that's very unfamiliar to them. And it can be very intimidating and frightening, quite frankly. And we didn't talk about this earlier, but in the eviction process, there's a first step called the show cause hearing. And in Washington, about 50% of those show cause hearings end in default. And that's a lot of people who don't show up and are evicted right then and there.
If I may. Yeah. Senator, I'm so sorry to cut you off, but I want our listeners to know what you just said. So when you say this percentage of these hearings end in default, can you put that in lay terms? What that actually
Sure,
means?
I'm sorry. That's the lawyer in me.
I know, no, I get it, but I'm fighting for the non-lawyers among us.
Thank you. I have to be reminded of that. Yes, so what that means is that the landlord wins just out of the gate, and there's no coming back, okay? And so, yeah, so it's a final decision by the court. There is a writ of restitution that is issued to the landlord at that moment, and the tenant is without recourse. I mean, they can try and appeal it, but again, then you need a lawyer to do that, and it's a complicated process, and most people do not do that. In fact, quite honestly, and this is why the notice is so critical to have that information in the notice, because a lot of times when before we changed the law a couple of years ago, when a landlord served the tenant just moved. And before we changed the law, they had 3 days to get out. And a lot of times they just picked up and they moved into their car and off they went because they didn't want to have an eviction on their record. And so this process is only going to capture those people who have information and know that there is a chance to save their tenancy. And the thing is that before we changed the law and before we have the information in the notice, like I said, people were not even fighting it. They were just leaving. And that's because they knew that the cards were stacked against them, and they seriously were. I mean, we started with a statute that had criminal nomenclature in it, for crying out loud. The tenants were guilty of unlawful detainment. It was a 3-day pay or vacate notice, 3 days to pack up your things and get out or pay everything that you had behind you. It was also unusual in that it was a fee shifting statute. And as a lawyer, I can tell you that you have fee shifting statutes in rare circumstances when you're trying to deter a certain kind of conduct, like we have it for our Consumer Protection Act or the Washington Law Against Discrimination, where you're trying to deter a certain kind of conduct. What are we trying to deter when someone's behind in the rent? That don't get hit by a bus, or don't have an unexpected medical bill, or a child care issue, or a car repair? I mean, it was punitive, and it was a slam dunk win. There was no judicial discretion built into that law. The landlord won every time. That's why people just picked up and left. They didn't fight it. We're trying to make, as Representative Macri said, we're trying to put some balance into the law and give tenants an opportunity to right the situation, to access resources that we have allocated both at the federal level and the state level for emergency rental assistance in order to save the tenancy. That is our goal. And to give people a runway, or an exit ramp out of this situation and back into the employment sector so that they can get their lives back on track.
That's a powerful concept. And when will we know if it's passing? What's the timeline to this law being real?
Well, it's in the House, so Representative Macri, maybe you want to tell the rest of the process there.
Yeah, sure. And I just got a text actually that it just moved out of committee just as we're meeting now.
Breaking news, everyone. We got breaking news.
With the bipartisan vote, which is great.
That's awesome.
Just shows the momentum that's building around this. And I think the understanding across the state about just the struggles that tenants are having, and also that small landlords are having, and how the state legislature can and should be helping. So our legislative session in Washington State goes through close to the end of April, and so this bill has to make another stop at a fiscal committee or appropriations committee before it heads to the House floor. And so it has a few more stops along the way before it gets to the governor's desk. We have been coordinating very closely with the governor's office all along the way. So we expect the governor to sign it into law when it does pass. And we're feeling pretty confident at this point. And as Senator Kuderer said, I know we're not the only state, but there are a few other states that have been pursuing right to counsel. But currently there are some jurisdictions, but no statewide right to counsel. And so that has also been something that's been exciting as we move forward with this. The pandemic really accelerated the conversation, but we know that this will be a long-term protection that will help tenants once we, get out of the impacts of the pandemic, and hopefully people start to get back to work, and we see fewer people who are struggling with their housing stability in months and years to come. So it's very exciting step forward.
Well, I part of me wants to wish you luck in beating the other states to it. It sounds like you have the runway ahead of you to fight to win that race. Thank you both so much for joining us here, and we hope to have you back with good news soon.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, Emily, thanks so much for having us.
Take care. So we've done a few of these episodes talking with lawmakers who are trying to bring the right to counsel into housing court. And what we are hearing across the board is really striking. We just heard from the representative that Black people, particularly Black women, are 6 to 7 times more likely to be evicted in Washington State, where right now 500,000 people are struggling to keep their homes, 200,000 people behind on rent, 300,000 people borrowing money or using credit cards just to try to keep up with the bills. And when that eviction moratorium ends, when the eviction cliff is in front of us, unless there is a right to counsel, these hundreds of thousands of people are going to be asked to stand in front of a judge alone and fight for their home. As the numbers have told us, people without lawyers don't have a fighting chance in eviction court. As the senator said, home is the foundation to your life. This is where people are fighting for something really, really essential. The state here, the state lawmakers we just heard from, seem to want to save that tendency. They recognize that keeping people housed is more efficient for the state, saves the state money, keeps people in their jobs, keep people able to pay taxes, able to engage in their community and in their society in a way that is productive and enhances the economic mobility of everyone around them. As the senator said, I think she said, good bang for the buck, and the benefit to the individual and their family is incalculable. Really exciting news. Thanks for joining us here on The Appeal Live. We look forward to bringing you all the latest news on the right to counsel in eviction court and everything else. You can follow us on Facebook or Twitter. I'm Emily Galvin Almanza. Thank you so much for joining us.